Welcome to the deep dive. All right, today we're taking a deep dive into some excerpts from a book called Collaborative Brief Therapy with Children.
Yeah.
And even if you're not a therapist, don't tune us out quite yet because this book has a lot of stuff in it that's really useful for anyone. And this book, it's really a fresh perspective on how kids see the world, how they look in their challenges, their problems. And it looks at how sometimes kids really thrive. And we really want to bring you the insights that are going to give you those aha moments about child development,
Yeah.
just those little nuggets of wisdom that really help you to understand kids better.
And that's our mission today, is to pull out the really practical tools, the strategies, and the research that anyone can actually use to understand the children in their lives and how to best support them.
So let's start with this idea of resilience in children.
Okay.
It's this amazing thing where some kids, they don't just kind of recover from difficult times,
Yeah.
but sometimes they even flourish. They really thrive. Right.
And, they're facing some very significant hurdles. And a lot of researchers were really curious about that. And Anthony and Garmese were a couple of researchers who really zeroed in on these resilient kids
And trying to really figure out what makes them so strong.
to figure out what makes them tick
Yeah,
and what was it about them.
exactly.
What were these magic ingredients? And the book highlights some of those key protective factors, and it looks at things like just their way of looking at things. They have an optimistic, explanatory style,
Yeah, having that positive outlook.
and they also have a lot of very strong support around them. People in their lives who really nurture them.
Yeah. And that could come in various forms. Like it could be relatives,
Yeah.
their family, it could be friends,
Right.
teachers, neighbors,
Right.
or even, some inspirational figures that they have in their lives.
Right.
But that social support system, the book mentions, is so key for these kids. And some of these kids also really relied on church involvement that really helped them.
Right. That spiritual aspect.
And their school experiences were also very significant. If they had a lot of successful school experiences, that really helped to make them more resilient.
Yeah. It's like these kids, even though they're going through some tough times, they have this belief that problems aren't these massive, insurmountable obstacles,
Right.
but they're more challenges they feel equipped to face
Yeah.
and eventually master.
Yeah.
Yeah.
They have this underlying belief. It's like, okay, I can get through this. I can do this.
Yeah.
And the book actually connects this directly to research on optimistic children.
Mm-hmm.
So kids who have a positive outlook tend to be more resilient.
Exactly. Makes sense.
Yeah. And so it's not just about thinking positively. It's one thing to have a positive outlook,
Right.
but you also have to be able to cope. And these kids, they actively cope. The book points out how they often seek comfort in their faith. They spend time with those supportive friends. They have mentors, role models, or they really engage in their activities. Maybe they're into sports. Maybe they have some kind of hobby that they really like to throw themselves into.
Right.
They're not just passive. They don't just sit there and just let it wash over them.
Exactly. They take charge.
Yeah, they take charge. And one of the things I found really interesting is this concept that Anthony had where he talked about two types of what he called cognitive competence in these kids. The first type is called constructive competence, and it's very practical. It's concrete. It's this problem-solving ability,
Right.
And these kids, they really demonstrate independence, self-confidence, and they're pretty darn good at just getting the job done.
Right.
And then you have creative competence, which is that's even a step further. So it's not just about those concrete solutions; it's more about the abstract and novel problem solving.
Right. Yeah.
So it's like they can think outside the box. So if you had a kid who was really good at Lego, they could follow the instructions and build something incredible, but maybe they could also take those same Legos and build something incredible that doesn't have instructions.
Right.
And it's that ability to just come up with unique solutions.
Exactly.
And so what can we do with all this information? How does this actually help us in real life,
Yeah.
So the book talks about how when we first sit down with a child and their parents and we're talking to them about the difficulties we're having, it's really helpful to explore what the child has done in the past and even what they're currently doing to try to deal with their problems.
To kind of get a sense of their process, how they think,
Yeah.
how they approach things.
Right. How do they try to get through these tough times? And so the book even suggests this idea of a victory box. I love this. So imagine a child writing down all their own personal successes. And it could be big things. It could be little things,
Mm.
getting a good grade, helping out a friend, figuring out a puzzle.
Yeah.
And along with that, they actually write down the steps they took. Like, this is how I did it.
Yeah.
And so they have this little box. And then when they have a new challenge, they can go back to that victory box and say, whoa, wait a minute. I've actually been successful before. I did this. I did this. I did this.
Right. To remind them of what they're capable of.
Yeah.
And to kind of give them that sense of their own efficacy.
Exactly. And so the book also, it really emphasizes this idea of social competence and how important it is for these resilient kids, because it turns out that, if they're socially competent, it really tends to boost their self-esteem.
Mm-hmm.
And it also really contributes to how well they do in school.
Right. Right.
Makes sense. So what's really interesting here is how it seems that a lot of these kids, they had their emotional needs met through a really wide social network.
Yeah.
It wasn't always just mom and dad.
Right.
Or just, siblings. It could be, neighbors, teachers, clergy, friends, parents, all of these different people kind of formed like a real safety net.
Yeah. Yeah.
And that's really powerful. And so, how does this inform the way we can support kids who might be going through something difficult?
Yeah.
Well, the book suggests actually involving the child's social network. So
Yeah.
friends, inspirational others, people they admire, maybe some adults who really care about them. And you kind of bring these people in.
Yeah.
Almost like advisors.
Consultants.
Yeah.
Yeah. And the book even takes it a step further and talks about helping the child develop some skills, like, for example, assertiveness skills.
Right.
Through role-playing.
Mm.
And who better to get involved than their friends?
Yeah.
Have the friends participate in the role-playing exercises.
Yeah.
And then outside of the therapy setting, the friends can even be a natural support team.
Right.
Just to really reinforce those skills.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
Okay. So let's talk about the power of optimism.
Okay.
The book highlights some research that shows a really strong connection between parents who are optimistic
Mm-hmm.
and their children's optimism and how their children handle stress.
Right.
So if you're a parent who's kind of got a sunny outlook on things, chances are your kids are going to be more optimistic too, and they're going to handle stress better.
Right.
And what I found really interesting is, they talked about Selekman's work with the Penn Resiliency Research Project.
Mm-hmm.
And their findings suggest that the level of optimism in both parents and teachers actually acts as a huge protective factor against children developing problems like depression and anxiety.
Right.
That's incredible. Yeah.
That's a pretty powerful insight.
Yeah.
And the project actually also looked at teaching these kids what they call disputation skills,
Oh, yeah.
which is basically challenging those negative thoughts
All right.
that tend to come up, those self-defeating thoughts.
Mm-hmm.
So they gave these kids tools to really challenge those thoughts. And it turned out that these skills really helped them to stay more optimistic
Mm-hmm.
and avoid some of those emotional difficulties.
Right.
And they were actually also able to improve their academic performance.
Wow.
Yeah, pretty interesting, huh?
That is.
So what does that look like in practice? How can we actually nurture optimism?
Yeah. Good question.
Well, the book has some really useful techniques.
Yeah.
For example, you could have parents observe their child and actually keep track of the positive things their kid is doing and the responsible things that they're doing.
Right. Right.
And try to get the parents to focus on that instead of focusing on the problem. And even prompt them to kind of reflect on past successes.
Yeah.
Like ask them questions about times they've been successful
Yeah.
to reinforce that sense of what they're actually capable of doing.
Yeah, exactly. And even have them visualize, positive outcomes, whatever challenge they're facing.
Right.
Have them visualize a positive outcome
Yeah.
for that.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense.
And one of my favorite things is the what they call the compliment box.
Yeah.
So if you have a family and they tend to get stuck in this negativity,
Yeah.
they're always focusing on the bad.
Right.
Well, maybe everyone in the family can write compliments about the other people in the family, and they put them in a box,
Oh, yeah.
and then, maybe at dinner time they can all read the compliments.
Uh,
And it sounds kind of corny, but it can be really effective,
Yeah,
It
yeah.
really shifts the focus.
intentionally shifts the focus.
Yeah. And the book also suggests involving grandparents, extended family members, close friends,
Right.
just kind of having these positive influences
That's
around.
that support system.
Yeah. And this all leads into this whole field of positive psychology.
Okay.
And the book talks about this approach, which really, puts emphasis on what's going well for people,
Right.
rather than, what's going wrong. It focuses on their inherent strengths
Mm.
and their potential to flourish.
Right.
And so it's really a fascinating shift. And figures like Seligman and Csikszentmihalyi, these researchers, they were really instrumental in bringing about this shift in perspective
Yeah.
because, for so long psychology was focused on what was going wrong.
Yeah.
How do we fix this, and how do we deal with these mental illnesses?
Hmm.
And they kind of flipped the script a little bit and said, well, wait a minute, why don't we study the people who are thriving
Right.
and figure out what they're doing right? What are their secrets?
Yeah. What can we learn from them?
And Peterson and Seligman went even further, and they actually identified 24 core human strengths.
Oh, wow.
And they put these into 6 overarching virtues. So it's a really useful framework, I think, to think about positive qualities.
Yeah.
And they actually developed these tools, the VIA, values in action classification of strengths, and the inventory of strengths for youth.
Hmm.
And as the book mentioned, you can actually find this online at viastrengths.org.
Oh, great.
And the book suggests using these questionnaires with parents and children who are over 10 to really figure out their top strengths.
Okay.
So what's the benefit of all this? Of knowing your top strengths? Well, it helps people to become more self-aware, obviously.
Yeah.
But it also really boosts self-esteem. And I think one of the great things about it is it gives families a shared positive vocabulary.
Yeah.
So instead of always focusing on you do this wrong, you do that wrong, now they have this language, this shared language to use to really acknowledge the good things.
Right. And to really build each other up.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay. So let's talk about the importance of collaborative approaches when we're trying to understand the difficulties a child is facing.
Yeah.
The book really emphasizes this idea that you need to get multiple perspectives. It's
Right.
not enough just to have one person kind of weighing in on this. And a really interesting technique, I thought, was the reflecting team.
Oh, yeah.
So you have a group of professionals, and they're observing a therapy session with a family.
Hmm.
And then afterwards, they all offer their perspectives and their insights. And this can be really helpful because you have all these different points of view, and sometimes they can really challenge those fixed beliefs that might be present in the family.
Right. Yeah.
It can really open up new ways of looking at the situation.
Yeah.
And the book also talks about this idea of a don't know mind,
Yeah.
which it comes from Buddhist philosophy. And it's suggesting that this could be a useful stance for therapists to take when they're in these collaborative meetings. And so what does that really mean?
Yeah.
Well, it basically means that you're trying to put aside your assumptions and you're really listening openly to what everybody else is saying.
Right.
And it's especially important when you have multiple people involved in trying to help a child.
Yeah.
And the book really made this this great point, which is that sometimes when we're so focused on this positive outlook, we might overlook the concerns
Yeah.
of other helpers who maybe have a more pessimistic view.
Right.
And so it's important to create a safe space where everyone feels comfortable to really voice their worries or their observations, even if they're negative.
Right.
And one of the really important takeaways from all this is that you don't actually need everybody to be in agreement
Yeah.
to be able to do some effective problem solving.
Right.
So the book, it kind of reframes these concerned helping professionals not as obstacles. It's not like they're trying to get in the way.
Right.
They're actually allies, and they're bringing valuable experience and wisdom to the table.
Exactly. It's about recognizing that, understanding what a child is going through is like piecing together a really complicated puzzle.
Right.
And the more perspectives you can have, the more complete the picture is going to be.
Right. And so let's get into some of the real practical tools, the techniques.
Okay.
First of all, this idea of exploring past successes.
Yeah.
So asking very specific questions that can help the family recall times when they successfully navigated challenges in the past.
Right.
And the book gives some great examples, like, asking them, about previous crises. Maybe something really bad happened in the family, or maybe the child had to cope with a really tough transition,
Hmm.
and how did they get through that? How did they make it to the other side? And the idea is that you're really trying to help them tap into existing but maybe forgotten resources
Mm.
of strength,
Yep.
of problem solving, the stuff that they already have.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. And the book also really stresses the importance of having an understanding of child development.
Mm,
What's normal,
right.
what isn't normal,
Right.
and how that can play into the challenges a child's facing.
Yeah. And it's a really good reminder that every child develops differently,
Hmm.
and what you see on the surface, that doesn't necessarily tell the whole story.
Right.
You might see a child behaving a certain way and you might think, oh my gosh, that kid is really out of control.
Right.
But maybe there's something going on underneath that we need to understand.
Exactly.
And the book talks about, gathering information in a lot of different areas, like the child's temperament, their level of self-awareness, how they manage their moods, their problem-solving skills,
Hmm.
their self-motivation, empathy, social competence, how they're doing in school. And it's not just about the child, it's also about the parents, right?
Right.
It's like, how are they coping with this? What are
Mm.
their typical ways of responding? And another really great tool is using observation tasks.
Oh, yeah?
And I love this one, the imaginary magnifying glass.
Yeah.
So you ask the parents, imagine that you have a magnifying glass,
Mm-hmm.
and I want you to really pay attention to what your child is doing, and I want you to look for the encouraging things that they're doing, the positive steps they're taking.
Right.
And write that down.
Yeah.
Make a note of it. And the idea is to get them to really shift away from just focusing on the problems
Yeah.
and really notice, like, oh, my kid is actually making some progress, even if it's just a tiny little step. And they talk about this case example of William, who was referred because of disruptive behavior. And his mother, Renee, had a really long list of complaints. And so the therapist made a point of actually shifting the focus. So instead of focusing on William and all the bad things he was doing, she said, let's focus on you, Renee. How are you coping with this?
Right.
What are your mechanisms? And she actually even had some sessions with Renee alone.
Wow. Interesting.
Yeah, and it just goes to show that sometimes if you address the parents' perspectives and their issues first, it can really create this more stable foundation
Yeah.
for helping the child.
Hmm.
And let's talk about goal setting. The book talks about this miracle question, which is a really cool way to help families kind of imagine their ideal outcomes for the therapy.
Yeah. What would they want to see happen?
Right. So the miracle question is like, imagine that you go to bed and you wake up in the morning and this problem has magically disappeared,
Mm-hmm.
as if by a miracle.
Right.
What would your life be like? And that's how you start the conversation,
Yeah.
And it helps them to really articulate their hopes and what kind of changes do they really desire. And the book even suggests including absent family members in this thought experiment.
Oh, really? How
So like, okay, so the miracle happened,
Right.
and how would this other person who's not here, how would their perspective change?
Yeah.
How would their situation change?
That's interesting.
And it really kind of broadens the scope of what they think is possible.
Right.
Yeah. And a really useful starting point, according to the book, is to identify what they call pre-treatment changes.
Oh.
So these are the things that maybe are already starting to get better,
Hmm.
even before the therapy is formally begun.
Oh, that's interesting. Yeah.
Yeah. And I thought, the book talked about scaling questions,
Mm-hmm.
and that was really helpful, using a scale of 1 to 10
Right.
to measure progress and also their confidence in achieving their goals. So like, okay, so on a scale of 1 to 10, 1 being no progress, 10 being you've reached your goal. Where are you right now? And then you can ask them, okay, so you're at a 4.
Mm-hmm.
What would it take to get you to a 5? What
Okay.
would you need to do? And the answer to that actually often becomes the initial treatment goal.
That makes sense.
Yeah. And so you're really focusing on small, manageable steps.
Yeah.
The book really emphasized that.
Right.
That the goals should be small, concrete, they should be realistic, and they should be behavioral, something that you can actually see.
Mm-hmm.
And they have this blueprint for change plan
Okay.
with 6 parts. So it includes the pre-treatment changes, the target behaviors,
Hmm.
their strengths,
Okay.
the solution determined system, the
Okay.
treatment modality selection, and the therapeutic experiment menu.
Wow. That's a lot.
It is, yeah. It's a lot, but it's a really, I think it's a really nice, comprehensive, and collaborative approach.
Yeah, definitely.
Now let's look at mindfulness practices. And the book offers some really practical ways to introduce mindfulness to children. And it focuses on very concrete activities. So
Right.
it's like, paying attention to your breath, noticing each step when you're walking,
Hmm.
listening to the sounds around you. These are all really great ways to kind of ground the child in the present moment.
Right.
I really liked the suggestion of cloud shape watching.
Yeah.
It's a fun and gentle way to kind of disrupt those negative thought patterns, get them outside.
Hmm.
It's really simple, but it can be quite powerful. And the book also introduced this idea of the holding environment from Winnicott.
Oh, yeah.
And I thought, maybe you could kind of explain what that is, because I know you're a fan of Winnicott.
Right. So the holding environment is really about creating a safe, reliable, and predictable space,
Hmm.
both physically and emotionally.
Right.
And it's an environment where the child feels that their difficulties will be understood
Yeah. Hmm.
and that they'll receive the help they need. And it involves um, something the book calls intelligent listening.
Hmm.
Where you really, really pay attention
Yeah.
and try to understand. And it also involves gradually increasing the time intervals between sessions
Mhm.
as the child progresses, which helps foster their independence.
Okay.
And one of Winnicott's techniques is the squiggle game.
Oh, yeah.
It's a really nice way to engage with kids
Yeah.
through drawing,
Right.
and it's spontaneous,
Yeah.
and there's storytelling involved.
Yeah.
And it really allows the child to express themselves, non-verbally, which can be helpful for younger kids
Right.
or kids who, maybe don't have the best verbal skills yet.
Right.
They can express those feelings in a different way.
Okay. And then another concept that the book touched on was narrative coherence.
Oh, yes.
And I thought that was really interesting. And it's this idea that, research has shown that, the ability to access and make sense of your own story,
Hmm.
your own life, to create this narrative of your experiences,
Mm.
that is really linked to being able to have healthy interpersonal relationships.
Interesting.
Yeah. And the book suggests this really nice practice where you invite the parents to share stories about their own childhoods with their kids.
Oh, yeah.
It's a way to really strengthen family bonds,
Hmm.
and it helps the child understand their own roots, where they came from.
Yeah.
And the book also talks about how important it is to be sensitive to the child's temperament,
Yeah.
understanding their temperament.
Hmm.
And that each child is born with their own unique temperament, their characteristic way of responding to the world.
Right.
And when you have a mismatch between the parents' responses and the child's temperament,
Right. Yeah.
that can lead to clashes, misunderstandings, more conflict. And the book wisely recommends that the parents really try to identify their children's temperaments,
Right.
and then they can tailor their reactions and their parenting strategies to better align with the child's natural tendencies.
Right.
So, for example, a kid who has a really strong will,
Right.
maybe instead of giving that child a direct instruction,
Hmm.
you give them two options.
Yeah.
You say, you can do this or you can do that,
Yeah.
and then they get to choose.
Right.
But you're still kind of guiding them in the direction you want them to go.
Right. Exactly.
Okay, so now let's talk about this really interesting approach called externalizing problems.
Okay.
And this is a key concept that comes from narrative therapy, which the book discusses. And it's this idea that you're looking at problems through this much wider lens.
Yeah.
You're taking into account things like gender roles and cultural expectations, issues of social justice, And so you're really trying to help the individual see the problem as separate from themselves.
Hmm.
So it's not like you are the problem.
Right.